I'm here with Rabbi Ysoscher Katz. Rabbi Katz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Daniel, for having me.
I would love to get a sense of your view of the wider Orthodox landscape. In a second, I'm going to ask you about your own background because I think you bring in a really fascinating background into this conversation. But you are one of the heads of Chovevei, which is, situated in the Open Orthodox community. So it's not quite seen as Orthodox by the mainstream Orthodox community. We can talk about that and unpack that in a second, but it's clearly considered Orthodox by everyone outside of the Orthodox community. So it's one of those, optical illusions. But I would love to just hear your thoughts on Orthodox sociology in the 21st century.
Yeah, wow, that's a funny place to start because, to be very honest and very frank with you off the bat, I mean, maybe I should kind of leave it for a little bit later. I don't know if I should go full throttle right away, but the sociology of Orthodoxy is not something that excites me and gets me passionate. It really doesn't mean that much to me. I mean, I like to tell people all the time that, my Orthodox identity is background information. It's not my essence. My essence is that I was raised Haredi and love the way I was raised. Love the chinuch that I got. I was raised in Satmar in a Hasidic context, and I still see myself as Hasidic. In fact, in my family, the joke is when the people ask my kids and me, how do you identify? Modern Orthodox, Open Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. I was like, modern Hasidic. And really, I think that's really how I see myself. Hasidus is a big part of who I was growing up and still is. And I think that that's really where I would love to see Orthodoxy go. Since you did ask the question, I do think that the whole obsession with identity is something that I find baffling. Let's put it that way. I'm baffled by this whole obsession with, are you Orthodox? Are you not Orthodox? Yeah, I'm Orthodox, but I mean, if you want to say I'm not Orthodox, fine, say I'm not Orthodox. It seems to me something that is really a distraction, because, observant Judaism across the board is struggling. I mean, and that's true for the ultra-Orthodox community, that's true for minor Orthodox community, that's true for the Open Orthodox community, for the lack of a better term, even though I don't like the term, in the sense that it's not as exciting as we would like it to be. People are not flocking to Orthodoxy. And I think that our job is to try to figure out what it is, at least for those of us, and I'm going to speak just for myself, not for anybody else, for those of us who find Orthodoxy incredibly exciting, incredibly meaningful, incredibly rewarding. We need to figure out a way to translate that excitement and translate that meaningfulness, so that it is meaningful to other people as well. And at least partially, and again, we'll talk about it a little bit later more in detail, is I think at least partially, the reality is something that many people have pointed out, which is that most people who identify as Orthodox live a bifurcated life. Because in the world that they live in outside of their Orthodox observant milieu and outside of the observant orbit, the world is, egalitarian, inclusive, open, and a lot of those things. And yet, when the moment we enter to a halakhic / Orthodox space, that's no longer the case. And that dissonance is hard. It's hard intellectually, and it's also hard emotionally. For a lot of, I mean, if I look at myself, I like to joke always with my students that if ever there was a person that needed to check their privileges, it's me. I am male, I'm a Kohen, and I got a yeshiva bachur education. Orthodoxy has never failed me at all. But I have daughters. I have, students and family members who identify as queer, and they feel excluded by the system. They feel left out by the system. And our job is to, try to minimize the degree of exclusion that Orthodoxy and halacha seems to demand and expect. That's number one. And number two, to the extent that we will never completely eliminate elements of exclusion in Orthodox halacha. That's my view. I believe that Orthodoxy can become more inclusive, more egalitarian, but Orthodoxy cannot erase certain degrees of gender and other kinds of hierarchies. And given that's the reality, we have to make Orthodoxy and observance so exciting that people will say, you know what, I get so much out of it that I'm willing or able to hold my nose when it comes to those places and those situations where I'm not thrilled with where Orthodoxy is. So
Yeah,
that's
no, it's really interesting. You started with saying that Orthodoxy is in a crisis. I mean, I as I was telling you offline, I've been more in the pluralistic Jewish community, and that's a community where demographically it clearly seems like it's in crisis in terms of just membership in non-Orthodox synagogues, and it seems like from the non-Orthodox vantage point, you look across at the Orthodox community, and demographics seem to be going great both in America and Israel. Kiruv movements both in terms of Chabad and the Litvak world. Things like Aish seem to be successful. So it's really interesting to hear your perspective. Things aren't going great, and so you can comment on that if you want. But I want to ask you, if you can explore a little bit, how you grew up. I've talked to plenty of, Chabad rabbis on the podcast. I don't think I've ever talked to somebody with a Satmar background, because I think by definition, if you were still fully in Satmar, you probably, we never would have been connected. So, talk to us a little bit about, what does it mean to grow up Satmar? And then eventually I have a feeling, and, I think some of your posts might highlight this fact, the Litvak / Hasidic dichotomy leads you to have a little bit more of a inclusive view of halacha than you might if you would have grown up in the Haredi Litvak community. So we'll get to that in a minute, but I would love to hear about your background.
Yeah, so I mean, briefly, the story is that, like I mentioned before, I grew up in Williamsburg and Satmar, in the Satmar community. And, as I often tell people when people ask me, oh, you grew up in Satmar and what happened? I'm like, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't have any horror stories for you. Oftentimes when people talk about leaving, or not often, but there are times when people talk about leaving, and it will unfortunately involve, bad stories about drug use, stories about broken families, or other unfortunate situations. That's not my story. I grew up in a Satmar community and had a really, really an incredible experience, spiritually and emotionally. I mean, I, as someone who loves Torah learning and does it all the time, I still teach Torah full time. The education was phenomenal, albeit at a cost for secular education. I didn't get any secular education whatsoever. But then again, because I am a Jewish professional, it hasn't impacted me that much. But I loved what I learned there. I really loved what they gave me, and I also was, Baruch Hashem, blessed to grow up in an incredibly beautiful, warm, and loving home. My father, passed away 10 years ago, Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, and my mother had this incredibly beautiful relationship, really warm home. And I thrived in the community, grew in the community, went to yeshiva, got married in the community. But at some point, I started to kind of a little veer off intellectually. Started asking questions, and one question led to another, led to another, led to another. And at some point, the questions became overwhelming enough that I felt that I need to search for another community. And because, like I said, my overall experience with growing up in Satmar was good, I just needed a place where I can more openly and more comfortably, grapple with my struggles and with my questions. I knew from the outset, most probably, I would say, that I'm not leaving Orthodoxy. I'm not, interested in chucking the system, so to speak, or dropping it. Fortunately, unfortunately, I never had a temptation to do anything, usher. I never in my life craved the cheeseburger. I never in my life craved to be Machal Shabbos. I just kind of wanted to have a place where I can explore more philosophical and theological challenges. And then at some point, I gradually moved out of the community. I did it later in life. I was already married with a family. I had a pretty prominent job in the community. I taught Daf Yomi, every night for 9 years to a crowd of about 100 people, which was very meaningful and very rewarding. But, intellectually and philosophically, we ended up growing further apart. And that's when I started looking, and long story short, around the time when I started searching for a community is when Rabbi Avi Weiss started Yeshivas Chavavei Torah, and like, oh, that's awesome. It's a yeshiva. I can teach Torah, but it defines itself as open orthodoxy, and I'm doing it with quotation marks because I'm not sure. I like the term, and I'm not sure Rabbi Weiss still cares about the term. So I thought that would be a good place for me, a home, and indeed, that's been my home for the last 25 years.
Talk to us a little bit about your view of the evolution of halacha and sort of what ideas lead you to say, well, it's clear that, you've written a lot of, fascinating response just on all sorts of contemporary issues. You can, draw on that if you want, but we're, and maybe it's a little bit fuzzier than obviously black and white, but sort of like talk to us a little bit about your view of halachic evolution or halachic change. It's clear, and I'll just paint this for listeners, it's clear that in the last 200 years, there's been no such thing as stagnant, right? So no Jewish community is doing it the same as we did in the shtetl in, the 1700s. So by definition, even if you say you're going to freeze everything in time, that is itself a change because for the previous 1,000 years, nothing was ever stagnant. So there's really no way to remain just, well, we're going to keep doing it the way that everyone did it in 1750. So all sorts of groups change. What's interesting, I find, about open Orthodoxy and maybe even modern Orthodoxy, a little bit, is they at least are willing to admit that they are, innovating and changing, and open Orthodoxy, obviously more than modern Orthodoxy. So I would love to hear a little bit about your philosophy about halachic change.
Right. Yeah. So I'm just going to repeat a variation of what you said, and I like to kind of say half jokingly that people like to describe the various communities as ultra-Orthodoxy and modern Orthodoxy writ large, and I say that that's a misnomer. Actually, there's no such a thing as ultra-Orthodoxy and modern Orthodoxy. All of us are modern Orthodox. It's just slow modern Orthodox and fast modern Orthodox, in the sense that it's ridiculous. I mean, this is the point that you made. It's ridiculous to kind of think that, oh, the Haredi community doesn't change. Change happens in every community. Communities evolve, realities evolve, understandings of notions evolve, and sometimes it's small changes, sometimes it's big changes. I like to use an example, although it's not the best example, and I recognize it's a little bit complicated, is that when I was in the community about 25, 30 years ago, is when this phenomenon started where people who were struggling in marriages or other issues, they would go to therapists. And there was a huge uproar in the community. That's usher, and that's, can I get halacha, and that's, can I get, that's not in accordance with the Torah, and there were all these big posters, with all the rabbis signing on about Ysoscher. Well, guess what, Daniel? 20 years later, 25 years later, it's a given that anytime when a couple struggles in a relationship, it's like, oh, here's a therapist you should go to. Here's a guy to go to. Now, it's not a great example, but there's tons of examples about this. So I think that, there is a recognition that reality changes, and the changes of reality is not in and of itself a reason to change halacha. I don't believe that that's what happens. What happens is that the changed reality forces us to go back to the halakhic system, go back to the sources, and just give it another look and say, you know what, in light of what I know now, is it possible that there are things that I haven't noticed, things that I haven't missed, that are there, that were there all along, but suddenly it turns out that now I have a better understanding of it. And I believe that that's really, at least from my perspective, as you mentioned before, I've written quite a few tshuvot on a lot of contemporary issues, and most of them are driven by an overarching sense of, inclusiveness. I mean, I've written a lot of tshuvot on trying to make the shuls more inclusive for women. And part of it came out as a result of my job as a rabbi in a modern Orthodox shul in Brooklyn. And I said simply, we live in a different time, and it is a time when women come to shul just as men. And that raises questions that earlier poskim didn't have to address. The example, I wrote a tshuva about nursing a baby in shul, for example. Or another one was, can you hold a baby while you daven or you read the Torah? And in both cases, I introduced my tshuva by saying, if you're going to look for an answer in the poskim, can a woman who has given birth and has a little baby nurse a little baby in shul? Or can a father or a mother hold their newborn baby in shul? What should I do? If you look for the poskim and say, No, what's the problem? Let the mother stay home and feed the baby at home. Let the mother stay home so the baby doesn't have to be in shul. Because there was not a understanding that, no, of course the woman wants to go to shul just as much as the man, as the husband. The wife just wants to go to a shul just as much as the husband. So what happens now is, all of a sudden, I'm in a shul, I'm a rabbi, and the woman says, what should I do? I'm here in shul, and I have a little baby that needs to be fed. So I'm not going to say, oh, it used to be usher, now it's mutter. What I will say is, okay, let's go back to the sources. Let's microscopically analyze stuff that we looked at only superficially because it didn't matter. And all of a sudden, we notice things that we haven't seen there. And I've done the same when it comes to issues of queer inclusion, which I've written extensively. I don't think that anything I've done is so different than what poskim have done all the time. Whenever an issue came up, they said, oh, let me take another look. And that other look was a much more intense look and a much more close look. And then you notice stuff that has not been there before. And I think that's the halakhic tradition in a nutshell.
I would love to hear a little more about your shuvot / responsa about queer inclusion, because I'm imagining a lot of listeners heard that and they're, not being able to square the circle on, orthodoxy and queer inclusion.
Yeah. So once again, I'm coming back to the shul where I was a rabbi, and it's a shul in Brooklyn, and need I say more? Brooklyn, the mecca of liberalism, and if it's an Orthodox shul in Brooklyn, it is by definition a liberal Orthodox shul, which it was. And it so happens that because it's in Brooklyn, there actually was a significant number of people in the shul, members of the shul, who identified as queer, as LGBTQ. And it just raised issues, it raised questions. And because, like I said before, I'm a chassid. I love spirituality. I love Yiddishkeit. I love davening. I love the shul space. The shul space kind of really puts me in this incredibly elevated spiritual space. And because, like I said before, I feel so privileged. I feel so blessed that, I've been blessed with learning, with Torah, with all of that. I feel that I want to share this with everybody. This is so fun. This is so exciting. I want everybody to have access to it. And yet we know that traditionally communities, shuls, and the halakhic system writ large has not been so welcoming to the queer community. So basically, what I decided was, that a lot of assumptions we make about the place of queer people who identify as LGBTQ in the halakhic system. And let me take a look again. Let me just check and let me take a look again. Just 2-3 silly examples. There was a lesbian couple in my shul, and they all of a sudden had a baby. So then the question became, what do we do about a bris? Who does the bris? Who is responsible for the bris? What happens with a pidyon haben? I mean, traditionally, a pidyon haben is the father's responsibility, but there is no father. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the conversations, but it turns out that after a close examination, it turns out that actually there are ways to create ritual that is meaningful and is halachically rigorous, even where there isn't necessarily a father. And the other example I like to use, and it's a little bit of a nuanced example, and indulge me just for a minute, is that I love this story, and my guess is that some of your listeners must have heard me say this before, but I just love it so much. So again, this was this lesbian couple in my shul, and once before Pesach, the phone rings, and I look at the phone and I see, oh, it's one of the members in the couple. And again, I don't want to be cynical, but before Pesach, at some point, there is a list of about 6 to 10 shilas that everybody asks, and you're like, okay, no, okay, it's gonna be a question. Rabbi, how do I kasher my microwave? Or Rabbi's kinwa kitnia. Not that I dismiss it, but at some point, after many years that a rabbi, you know already more or less what to expect. And I'm thinking, okay, it's gonna be another one of those. Well, guess what, Daniel? That's not what it was. I pick up the phone and say, hello, hi, how are you? Says, oh, Rabbi, I have a shilah. What's a shilah? She says, Rabbi, my partner and I are different. I'm Sephardi and she's Ashkenazi. What should I do about Kityon and Pesach? I'm like, wow, that's a first. I don't think any rabbi has ever gotten the shaila about what to do about Kityon in the case of a same-sex couple. So here's the fascinating thing in a nutshell, Daniel. It made me look into the halacha of minhag, right? A family minhag. Now, if you Ask anybody superficially and say, oh, when a couple gets married, what's the practice about minhag? They would say, oh, you follow the husband's minhag. That's kind of the traditional notion. You follow the husband's minhag. But it turns out that's not true. The idea is that when a couple is married, they have to have uniform minhag. That's the halacha. Now, in a patriarchal society, if you can only have one minhag, obviously you're going to pick the husband's minhag. But that's not at all true. You just have to sit down, the husband and wife, and say, we can't one day do Sephardi practice, and tomorrow Ashkenazi practice, one do Polish practice, another day German practice. You got to sit down and decide, okay, what kind of home do we want to have? So I said to them, listen, either you decide that your home is going to be Sephardi, or you decide your home is going to be Ashkenazi. And whatever it is, you just have to follow consistently. I just said to them, by the way, you should know, on Pesach, it's good to be Sephardi, but there are times when it's actually harder to be a Sephardi than Ashkenazi. So just know what the costs are. See, those are examples of where I come in with the sense that A, Judaism is beautiful. B, it's hard for me to accept theologically that the Torah has designed a system that excludes people. C, I'm committed to the Orthodox system. D, the Orthodox system still can get, re-examined and bring us to places where we notice things that we've not noticed before.
I love that. And now I feel vindicated that I definitely took my Sephardi's wife's kidney out minhag there. So no, I appreciate that. So I want to go back, about 1,000 years in history, because I teach an entire class at UC Irvine essentially about Maimonides. And I found your posts, Maimonides / Rambam, over the years really interesting and also personally challenging. And so I would love, I'll let you talk about it. I actually assigned one of your articles. I think it was Rambam is not the answer. I assigned that actually to my college class of 60 students who I think were engaging with Maimonides for the first time, because I kept, coming back to this, controversy that, right after Maimonides passed away, with the spread of the Guide to the Perplexed, where some communities rejected and some accepted. And then, of course, you have, the Kabbalistic boom and those tensions. But I would love for you to talk, one, what is it that Maimonides did that changed at least some subset of Judaism so drastically, and why are you so against that?
Right. I mean, I'm not an expert on Rambam. I'm not an expert on Rambam by far. I'm just trying to think how to say it best, because I feel very passionately about this issue, but I don't want my passions to take me over.
You've also, by the way, let me just say, while you're thinking, you've actually changed my mind about this, like through your post. I mean, if you would have asked me 6 or 7 years ago, and or if a student, I mean, I'll give a personal example. I mean, if a student asked me theologic questions or philosophic questions about Judaism, and I was trying to answer like a good 21st century rationalist that I, think and hope that I am sometimes, right? I go straight to, Rambam and negative theology and all of that. And your writings on this have actually challenged me to say, maybe that'll be one of my 2 or 3 answers, but to paint this, very majestic picture of, mysticism and spirituality that I think the Rambam does suck out of Judaism. So maybe I'll set you up in that way. This is not gearing up to an argument, but I find this so interesting.
You said it, I didn't say it, so then I feel much better. Again, it's personal. It's personal on 2 levels. It's personal, because like I said, but let me back up a little bit. I feel like I'll tell this story. I'll share a story. It's a really terrible story, a really horrible story, but it's going to make the point. So the story, long story short, is that my family back in Williamsburg once befriended this Ger Tzedek, which is kind of an anomaly. Haredi community is not very,
just to translate for listeners, somebody who converted into Judaism.
Yeah, sorry. Somebody converted to Judaism. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is, my family got to know this person and adopted him, and we were very close for many years. He got married. He had a family in the community and all of that. And tragically, one day, he just disappeared. He just left, walked out of his wife, walked out on his kids, disappeared. We tried to find him. We tried to help the wife get a get. Nada. Couldn't hear from him. No response and nothing. And then one day, one of my relatives walks down the street in Brooklyn, and he's walking, let's say, this way, and towards him from the opposite direction, he sees this Ger Tzedek, this come. His name is Shmuel. I can say his name, nobody knows who he is anyway. And he notices that there's a woman walking next to him. And he was very shocked, and he goes over to him and says, "Hi, Shmuel." And Shmuel says, hi, this is my wife. I'm like, So my cousin said to him, your wife? How do you have a wife? You didn't get divorced your first wife. And he said the most obnoxious thing, but I'm just trying to get to make a point. He said, listen, I converted into Judaism. I chose to be Jewish. Well, if I choose to be Jewish, I can choose whichever version I want. I choose the Sephardi version that allows for polygamy. Okay, good luck. Whatever. You know, the end of the story is that he eventually ended up giving his wife again and all that. Why am I sharing the story? My personal frustration with modern Orthodoxy, and again, maybe some people will say it's chutzpah. Who are you? You're an interloper. You just showed up into modern Orthodoxy 20 years ago, and all of a sudden you already have, critiques and all that. But I see Rav Soloveitchik coming to America and finding a community that's tabula rasa. There's not much going on in Orthodoxy. And there he is at a crossroads where he has an opportunity to situate American modern Orthodoxy into one of two contexts, either the kind of more philosophical, German, rational kind of context, or a more mystical, spiritual, Hasidic context. And you know better than I that he kind of situated more. If you look at his kind of, philosophical books, they're hyper rational, hyper philosophical, and all that. And frankly, to me, that's a tragedy of modern Orthodoxy. It is really the tragedy of modern Orthodoxy. And the reason for that is because when people ask me, why did you end up being open Orthodox? Why do you end up being modern Orthodox? Like I said to you before, it's my Hasidus. My Hasidus is one that has led me to believe that there is Kedusha and there's holiness and that there is a, Tzelem Elokim, the divine spark in every person, in everything. I.e., there is holiness even outside of the four cubits of halacha, the 4 cubits of Torah. And that part of what drives me also to kind of create a Judaism that's inclusive, right? Because there is Kedusha everywhere, men and women, like Jew and non-Jew, heterosexual, homosexual, and all of that. And that passion really what drives me. And that passion is also what allows my modern Orthodoxy to be infused with an incredibly robust spirituality. I feel like oftentimes when you find people who identify as modern Orthodox, there's a bifurcation. There are times when I live my Orthodox part of my life, and then, I'll go to a ball game, I go to a movie, I'll go to the beach because I'm also modern. I don't know, I'll go to the opera. I do all of those things, but they're not bifurcated. I see HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the page of Gemara, in the page of Talmud. I see HaKadosh Baruch Hu in my Sidur, and I also see HaKadosh Baruch Hu when I go to the beach, when I listen to a beautiful piece of music, or even when I watch an exciting movie. And that is what brings me to the Rambam. I think, like you said, to quote you, Rambam's approach sucked out the spirituality of Judaism. It's a very sophisticated Judaism. It's a very, stimulating Judaism, but it lacks spirit, it lacks passion, it lacks enthusiasm. So that's number one. The other thing I'm going to say, 2 things, is that number one, because rationalism is so attractive, because we're rational beings by default, so when someone says, and Judaism is rational, then we kind of feel, oh yeah, sure, that makes sense. We forget or we overlook the fact that that's not biblical Judaism. Biblical Judaism is not a rational system. I tell people always, start learning, let's go and do Leviticus, let's do Vayikra. Like, was there rational to you? You bring a sacrifice and the sacrifice satisfies God. Now, again, I know that all can be interpreted in different ways. There is no doubt in my mind that classic biblical Judaism on its own terms. There's Philo and there's Josephus, and it can be interpreted in other ways. The simpler read of the biblical tradition is a mystical tradition, not a rational tradition. And when it comes to the rabbis of the Talmud, it's harder to make generalizations, right? We were talking about thousands of pages spread over however many years, 600 to what many years, where we're talking about the period that's called the rabbinic period. But clearly, there is a significant mystical voice within that tradition. So I think because of those 2 things, I feel really, really, really frankly sad by the level to which the Rambam is the go-to person in modern Orthodox theological discourse. And I don't know if you want me to add. There's also another
No,
book.
it's so interesting. I mean, I'll just say I've been talking to, so I have a good friend who grew up also on Orthodox with me, and he's probably, the most traditional or still, very religious of all my good friends. And he recently told me that he's been reading Tanya, which is, just for listeners,
Mhm.
the foundational text of Chabad, one of the Hasidic movements. And I told him, it's really interesting because I've recently been reading a lot of, Hasidus and Kabbalah. And, he sort of knows me as, again, the person who
Right.
left Orthodoxy for theological reasons. And so, sort of just my mind always jumps to rationalism. And he was trying to ask me to explain why I found Kabbalah and the Hasidic tradition so interesting. And I was almost
Hmm.
having trouble explaining it rationally. And it was, it's like, it's not as if I read, the Zohar or modern Hasidus, and I'm like, yes, this is, pure truth, but also I don't think it's like just
Right.
nothingness. And I think one of the beauties of the Kabbalistic tradition, especially, is and just, from, I talked to Daniel Matt a couple of months ago on the podcast also, who translated the entirety of the Zohar, just a crazy, Herculean task. And one of the things that he kept coming back to is the Zohar constantly is almost playing around with when it says things. Is it literal? Is it metaphorical? Right? Are the Sefirot, are these 10, depictions of God, or
Hmm.
spheres or essences of God? Is that real? Is that not? Is that just from our vantage point? Is that from the vantage point of heaven? And I think the Maimonidean tradition of Judaism has allowed me to exist more in a gray area of truth and gray area of mysticism than Maimonides, who, it's a fascinating read, and I love teaching, Maimonides. And it's still, if somebody asks me for, classical Jewish medieval philosophy, you got to go Rambam. But in terms of a personal worldview, it does it for me much less than I think what Kabbalah allows me to do.
Yeah, yeah. No, first, so I couldn't agree with you more. I wrote an essay for Dr. Alan Brill, for Dr. Brill's website. I think it's called Kavanah or something, but I'm happy to share with you. And I talk a little bit about kind of more of the intellectual attraction to Hasidut. And one of the things that I find very exciting is, again, something that you touched on, which is, so much of contemporary modern religious conversation, and this is just not just Orthodoxy, religious writ large, is right. Truth, and what do you think about Torah Messina? Did the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai happen? And what are the stories of the Torah? Did they happen or not? And I feel very much that in my own Hasidic training, it was a silly question. It's a silly question because truth in a Hasidic context is something very different than truth in a Maimonidean concept. I don't know if we have enough time to kind of unpack that, but it's almost like I was recently wrote on Facebook, but it's also kind of something that I've talked about, many times before in different contexts. But I recently overheard two people talking, and one of them said to the other, "So what do you think? The stories in the Torah, and particularly in Genesis, happened?" And she said, "Yeah, of course it happened." He says, "Yeah, what do you mean?" She says, "It happened in the tomb." Like I'm not interested in this kind of extraneous conversation. Did it happen 2000 BC and all that? In the Torah, in the context of my religious discourse, that happened. And I think that's to a large part a product of a non-Maimonidean kind of discourse. I mean, another thing I'll tell quickly, just a story. I don't know if you want me to share that. You can tell me that. I felt there's a little of aside from the philosophical education and pedagogical piece, which I feel very passionately about. It's like Hasidic Judaism, mystical Judaism is so much more beneficial for the modern Jew. It allows them to get past so many of the challenges that one who adopts a Maimonidean approach have to grapple with. But there's a little bit of a personal issue, very personal, almost selfish, in the sense that, I grew up Haredi. And in the Haredi community, they teach only Rambam in his Yad HaChazakah, his books of laws, right? We don't study the guide of the perplexed. So I was completely oblivious as a young scholar to the guide. I knew that he wrote a guide, and we were always told, "Oh, the guide is deep philosophy, and I should learn it, and it can have, lead you to kind of bad places and all of that." Okay, and then I kind of rebel, rebel, and I read the guide, And there was a lot of things that troubled me, in terms of the Rambam's notion of prophecy and Rambam's notion of Chiyat HaMesim and Rambam's notion of theodicy and all of that. And like everybody else, all of a sudden I need to confront the discrepancy. Like, which is the real Rambam? Is it the Rambam in the one Rambam that you get, the impression of the Rambam that you get in his book on the laws? Or is it the Rambam that you get in his book in the guide? And then I get to the introduction and I come across that famous piece where the Rambam says that sometimes you can say untruths for the greater good of society. Right? It's it's usually referred to in Hebrew, right? The seventh premise or postulate or concept, whatever. So, in other words, it turns out that the Rambam admits that sometimes you say things, even though you're not ready to fully embrace them, because it's good for society to believe that. In other words, and I know I'm being simplifying all this, it's good to fool the masses for the greater good of the masses. I'm like, wait, that's me. I'm one of those masses that have been fooled by his books in believing that actually he fully embraces everything he writes in Yad HaChazakah, until I found out, oh, there's another book in which maybe he doesn't really embrace what he wrote in that other book. And I don't know, for a while it's childish, and I think I got over it. But for a while I was walking around the world feeling like, wow, you really did a good one on me, Rambam. And I think a combination of, this is not the big factor, but that plus the fact that I feel that modern religiosity would thrive and succeed much better if it's situated in a mystical / Hasidic context. And I want to say one last thing quickly. Oftentimes when people hear me say Hasidic and all of that, like, oh, they immediately think about, Hasidim that they kind of think of in Muncie or in New Square or even in Williamsburg. So I want to say two things about that. Is number one, I believe that there's a difference between Hasidus and Hasidish. Hasidish is an appearance, a behavior. That's how they dress, that's how they eat, and that's what they kind of, do. And then there's Hasidus, which is theology. And I tell people always, when I am advocating for a modern embrace of Hasidus, it's Hasidus, not Hasidish. In other words, I tell people all the time, you don't have to put on a shtreimel, you don't have to take off your pants, whether you're a man or woman, and take off your jeans. You can stay the way you are. You don't have to change anything. But your philosophy, your way of understanding the world, the narrative you tell is kind of a different one than someone who adopts a Maimonidean approach. That's number one. Number two, again, this is too technical, but Moshe Yedel and others talk about how Kabbalah has two pieces. There's the theurgy, and then there's the theosophy. Theosophy is more kind of the philosophy of Hasidut, philosophy of Kabbalah, and the theurgy is the idea that you can urge God and you can manipulate God and all that. I don't buy that one. That's not what excites me about Hasidut, that, oh, I can get God to do this, or if I, put on 5 tzitzit, or if I have this or that, this will happen. I don't care what happens or what doesn't happen. God should do what God needs to do. But the theosophy, the philosophy of the way you understand the world, that I find very attractive. And that is also what I think could bring an element of robust spirituality to the modern Jewish experience that it lacks right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love that distinction between Hasidus and Hasidish. There is an argument, a historic argument. We don't necessarily have to venture down here, but this is sort of the argument that I make in, my medieval Jewish philosophy class, which is, and it's not my argument, of course, but that, this, the Kabbalah that you then see that's much more theosophical, especially in the Zohar and such, would never have, arrived on the scene if it wasn't for Maimonides, setting up at least some basis. And so, the Zohar, when you read it and it attempts to describe God, it's clearly using Maimonides not as a conclusion, but as a premise, which has actually led to some very interesting scholarship that tries to go back and reread Maimonides as a mystic, which is not new. There was, you're for sure familiar, but just for listeners, Abraham Abulafia, who is a medieval Spanish mystic who, has a fascinating story of trying to, go and overthrow the popes. I'll let, listeners look that up on their own time. But he actually, was one of the most steadfast commentators on the Guide to the Perplexed, which led him to be one of the most prominent Kabbalists in his age. So it is very interesting. And, I like how you said it before. One of the interesting things about Maimonides, and then I promise we'll move on to a different topic for the last 10 minutes, is that every Jewish group attempts to claim Maimonides as sort of a intellectual, father of their own movement. I mean, you talk to Reform Jews, and it's, again, in that very, rationalist German spirit, it's, oh, of course, the Rambam was the first one to say there's no such thing as angels and devils, and that's all metaphor, and all Midrash is really just metaphor, and perhaps even the entirety of Exodus, all of that, versus, I don't know, if you go and talk to your local Chabad, who also, they're very big on studying, of course, the Mishnah Torah, right, the Rambam's halakhic work, they would say, of course, it's the 13 principles of faith and everything else. The Guide to the Perplexed is just apologetics, and you're allowed to sort of I don't know, fib for apologetic standpoints. I find it really interesting. One other thing that I know that you've commented on over the years, and I think your Satmar background would make you really interesting, to get your thoughts on. And maybe I'll start specific, and then we'll go more general. The specific, because obviously it's been in the news, every 2 months it's now the front page of the news, is questions of Haredim drafting to the IDF, which I know that you've talked a lot about. So I would love to hear a little bit about your perspective, because this is, I mean, one of the most interesting things. And again, I'm working with mostly non-Orthodox American college students on the West Coast. And so people have kind of heard of this debate, but what's interesting is how little people are like, oh yeah, it's some minor debate in Israel. Whereas, whenever I'm in Israel talking to friends of mine who, again, many of my friends, I went to a religious Zionist yeshiva. So I have many friends who went to the army and are still, my age with young kids, being drafted to Milim, but still fully Orthodox. And so this ends up being like the issue that tears apart Shabbos tables. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Right, right. So I'm going to say two things. Is that number one, it's a little bit full disclosure. It's a little hard for me to be this passionate about this issue, because it's very personal, deeply, deeply personal. Because thank God we have 5 children. 3 of the children are children who kind of grew up with me in the Haredi community, and then we have 2 younger children who grew up more in the modern Orthodox context. But nevertheless, all of our children are somewhere or another on the Orthodox spectrum. None of them, though, identify as ultra-Orthodox. And the reason why that's relevant is because of our 5 children, 3 of them served in the army. One of them was a shooting instructor. The other one is still a tank commander, and the other one served in a different capacity. And, one of my children actually currently served in Gaza. So it's really incredibly infuriating to me, the fact that such a big segment of the Israeli population does not serve in the army. And, it has tremendous tragic consequences, because the smaller the numbers, the greater the risk is on each individual person. The greater army, then you kind of divvy up the risk among a wider populace. So on the one hand, I'm so filled with resentment and anger and fury in a way that's, irrational, but I don't care. It's my family, it's my children, it's my friends' children, and all that. Having said that, I think that it's a little bit hard to see how the discourse is developing on this issue, because is there a halachic piece to this conversation in terms of who has to serve in a war in Israel, and is this war what's called in halachic terms, I'll use the Hebrew and translate, a milchemet reshut or a milchemet mitzvah, right? Is it a optional war, or is it a obligatory war, which has different rules of drafting, who has to draft? If it's only an optional war, then there are more exemptions allowed in halacha. If it's an obligatory war, there are fewer exemptions allowed in halacha and all that. Is there an element of that informs the Haredi thinking? Yeah, I think so. But the reality is that at the end of the day, a big reason, a big part for why the Haredim are so opposed to sending their children in the army is because the fact that they're afraid that their children are not going to come back religious. And that is true. That is true. The army definitely tends to be a melting pot, but it's a melting pot more often than not in one direction and not in the other direction. That it creates a certain element of either laxity. I want to be careful with terms. I don't know what terms, but more often than not, people who go into the army don't come out with the same level of religiosity and frumkeit. that coupled with the fact that a big segment of the Haredi population is anti-Zionist, so they don't believe that the whole Zionist project is, certainly not Reshit Tzmichat Gilatenu, not the beginning of the flourishing of the redemption. Most probably think it's illegitimate. So there's like so many heavy variables that argue in favor of refusing the draft that I'm not sure even how we're going to overcome it. I'm not sure we're going to overcome it. I think it's just such big obstacles to overcome. My hope is that they can come to a realization that to deny the requirement of anybody being drafted is just not tenable. It's just, really inappropriate. I don't want to use stronger terms, even though stronger terms come to mind. But there's going to be a realization that there's also a value in keeping a core group of people who are genuinely what's called in Israeli discourse. Again, I'll use the Hebrew and translate Torah, Imnat Torah, people who are genuinely dedicated for Torah study, and they should be exempt. And that's the best we can hope. But it's just painful. It's painful because it causes such a tremendous rift in Israeli society and in the Jewish community at large, and it turns people away from observance. I mean, it's not a good look for Orthodoxy. It's really not a good look for Orthodoxy, and not only is it not a good look not to participate in this incredible task, they need a better class of spokespeople. They have, I don't know, somehow the spokespeople always end up being people who say the most obnoxious, the most offensive, and the most off-putting things. And I don't know if it's obliviousness or it's casualness or it's callousness. It's just painful because, like I said in the beginning, I love Judaism, I love observance, and every time a spokesperson from their community opens their mouths, it's like, can you stop? Can you just stop? So it's Kabbalah.
Was it
It's
a
painful.
hard, like, I don't know if acceptance is the right word, and I haven't even asked you, if you identify as a Zionist, but by the way you're talking, I'm going to guess the answer is yes. Just for listeners' background, Satmar and Zionism don't seem to go, I'm saying that, lightheartedly, right? The Satmar
Yep.
Rebbe, obviously, Yoel Teitelbaum was one of the most vehement critics of Zionism in the 20th century, even after the state of Israel was founded. So, talk to us a little bit about the, coming to Zionism.
Sure, sure. So yeah, you're right. I identify as a very, very, I'll use a Yiddish term and translate it. I'm a very verbrent Zionist, like a hardcore, passionate Zionist, albeit on the liberal end of the spectrum, very progressive end of the spectrum in terms of my politics and so on and so forth. But you know, I joke always, and I tell people that the nice thing about growing up ultra-Orthodox, and particularly in South, is that if you want to rebel, you don't have to do sex, drugs, and rock and roll. If you become a Zionist, you're already a rebel. So yeah, I grew up in a very anti-Zionist context, and as I mentioned before, eventually you kind of start questioning. And one of the things that I questioned was whether. Now let me back up. I grew up in a context, in a Satmar context, where there's a very hardcore anti-Zionism, right? To the degree my guess is that you're aware of this, but perhaps your listeners are not aware of it, right? Satmar Rebbe, Yoel Teitelbaum, who was kind of the modern founder of the Satmar movement, of the Satmar community, was a incredibly passionate opponent of Zionism, has written books about it, and he has made the radical claim that the Holocaust came about because of the belief of Zionism, right? So I grew up believing that Zionism is such a terrible sin, such a terrible sin, so much so that it can justify the death of 6 million people. And all you need is a little crack in that edifice. It's like, wait, I don't believe it's such a terrible sin. And I don't know if you want me to say this. I joke always that it's a little bit of a off-color joke, but it's not an off-color joke. But in Israel, a very attractive woman is called a tzatzah, which is a little bit of kind of an inappropriate term, but it's called like a bomb, right? Just a bomb. But I like to say was that my tzatzah was the female soldiers who used to pass my yeshiva always on the way to the army base, which was not far from my yeshiva in Israel. I studied in Israel for 2 years. And the story is that a couple of my friends from Satmar went to Israel, the yeshiva. It's a long story how we ended up there and all that. And about 2 blocks away, there was an army base. So every morning when we would go to yeshiva, there would be a lot of soldiers, walking to the base. And it would be male soldiers and female soldiers. And and we had a silly game. It's a silly, stupid game. But we're Haredi, and we kind of look there at these women soldiers, and it's incredibly jarring to see a Jewish woman with fatigues, with a weapon. It's like shakes your whole world. And then on top of everything else, my friends and I had this kind of silly game of trying to guess what's her name, right? And it was like, oh, she must probably is Chani. She is Suri. And it was really a silly way of grappling with the fact that, wait, our sense of Chani and Suri was, some Haredi woman who has get married at 18 and is going to have a family with a lot of children. And now all of a sudden, the notion of femininity, the notion of women is just so different. And yet, they could be a Chani, they could be a Suri, they could be, religious, nice, typical Jewish women. And, once that facade, that it's not, the terrible sin of which justifies the deaths of 6 million people, once that facade is cracked, and it just kind of slowly, the crack breaks open. And over the years, I've come to embrace a very deep sense that Jewish sovereignty has metaphysical and spiritual significance. Do I necessarily believe that it's a Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu? Not sure, but who cares? That's not my issue. It has spiritual significance, like everything else I said before. I see divinity in the modern material world, and I see a divinity in the attempt of identifying, creating a Jewish sovereignty that's Jewish and dedicated to Jewish values. Does it have to be Orthodox? Yeah, not necessarily.
Yeah, and I'll just flag for listeners, I recorded an episode with Professor Shaul Magid about 6 months ago, and we called that religious anti-Zionism. If anybody's interested on delving more into that, Shaul Magid's a fascinating scholar that writes about all this. We've been talking for a while. I can probably talk to you for, 20 more hours before getting bored, but I'm curious if there's anything else that we haven't covered that you wanted to just finish with.
Like I said to you in the beginning before we started recording, I'm happy to talk. I tell people all the time that actually, even though I'm an educator, I really am a schmoozer. I just teach Torah because I want to schmooze about fun things. So I can schmooze with people for however long they want. But yeah, it's your show, Daniel. So I think you should take the lead and I'll follow. So
amazing. So I'm gonna thank you. This was super interesting. I told you this offline, but you're somebody I've wanted to talk to for a while because I know you just posted on Facebook that you're gonna slowly stop posting on Facebook, but I would tell listeners, any way they could get any of your content, they really should, because I think it is the perfect mix of like very deep traditionalism mixed with, again, everything you've been talking about, a sense of full embrace of the modern world without, again, that bifurcation that oftentimes you see in the Orthodox world, but a full analysis of the entirety of modernity through Jewish tradition. And I find that incredible. So, Ysoscher Katz, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, Daniel. Kol Tuv.